In the autumn of 1888, there was a monster stalking the darkest streets of London, a killer who claimed the lives of 5 women, carving his name into the pages of history with blood. But what if I told you this murderer was never caught, and his identity remains unknown even today? More than 130 years have passed. Hundreds of theories have emerged. Thousands of pages have been written. Yet Jack the Ripper still hides in the shadows of Whitechapel. I am a researcher who has spent 30 years in crime archives, and tonight I will take you back to that era's London. My name is Detective Inspector Frederick Abberline, or rather, that's who I should have been, because I am following in the footsteps of the real detective who handled this case at Scotland Yard. Every clue in your hands, every witness statement, every horrifying detail comes from the official records of that time. Picture this: gas lamps flickering in narrow alleys, horse-drawn carriages clattering over cobblestones, and the thick fog of industrial London hiding unspeakable horrors. This is where our story begins. The London of 1888 bore no resemblance to today's city, Whitechapel. Despite being only a few miles from Westminster, the heart of the city was like another world entirely. Narrow, muddy streets, smoking factory chimneys, and neighborhoods where despair roamed free. The air itself seemed thick with hopelessness, mixed with the acrid smoke from countless coal fires, and the stench of poverty that clung to every corner like a second skin. This was the East End, where life was cheap and death was cheaper still. Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Do you know what these 5 women had in common? They were all struggling to survive, forced to live on the streets, forgotten by society. They were what Victorian society politely called unfortunates, women who had fallen through the cracks of a rigid social system that offered no safety net for those who stumbled. Each had her own story of hardship, of dreams that had withered in the harsh reality of East London life. Each had her own reasons for walking those dangerous streets after dark, and each would meet a terrible end on those dark autumn nights. At that time, I was a 45-year-old experienced police officer. I headed Scotland Yard's Whitechapel division, and the responsibility for solving this case rested on my shoulders. But I can tell you this: 30 years of police experience didn't prepare me for the horror of this case. I had seen murder before, of course. In my years on the force, I had investigated stabbings in public houses, domestic disputes turned deadly, robberies gone wrong. But this was different. This was something that seemed to spring from the deepest nightmares of human imagination. The East End was a place where poverty and desperation created perfect hunting grounds for a predator. Women like our victims had little choice but to walk the streets at night, vulnerable and alone. The very society that had failed them would now demand justice for their deaths. It was a cruel irony that these women, invisible in life, would become the most famous victims in criminal history. Their names would be remembered long after the politicians and socialites of their era had been forgotten. Let me paint you a picture of what Whitechapel was like in those days. Imagine streets so narrow that 2 horse carts could barely pass each other. Buildings so close together that neighbors could reach across the gap and shake hands from their windows. The smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and industrial waste hung in the air like a permanent cloud. Children played in gutters filled with filth, and rats were so common that people barely noticed them anymore. This was not the London of grand boulevards and magnificent architecture that tourists see today. This was the London of the forgotten, the desperate, and the damned. It was into this world that our killer emerged, like some demon conjured from the very darkness of the streets themselves. August 31st, 1888, 3:40 a.m. A woman's body was found on Bucks Row. Ann Nichols, 43 years old. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary murder. Unfortunately, a common occurrence in these London neighborhoods. Charles Cross, a cart driver on his way to work, was the one who discovered the body. He later testified that when he first saw the figure lying in the street, he thought it might be a tarpaulin discarded by some tradesman. Only when he got closer, when he saw the pale flesh gleaming in the gaslight, did the true horror reveal itself. But Dr. Ralph Llewellyn's autopsy report changed everything. The woman's throat had been opened with two deep cuts, so precise they might have been made by a surgeon. Even more horrifying, the abdomen had been systematically cut open, the cuts showing a knowledge of human anatomy that chilled us to the bone. This was not a random attack by some drunken sailor or jealous lover. This was not the work of someone who killed in a moment of passion or rage. The killer possessed anatomical knowledge, surgical skill, and most terrifying of all, a cold, calculated approach to murder that spoke of a mind completely divorced from normal human feeling. The precision of the cuts haunted me. I had seen what knives did in the hands of angry men, had witnessed the ragged, desperate slashing of someone killing in the heat of passion. But these cuts were different. They were purposeful, methodical, almost artistic in their execution. Someone had taken time with Ann Nichols, even in the risky environment of a public street. Someone had worked on her body with the same care a craftsman might take with a piece of fine wood. 2 weeks later, on September 8th, Annie Chapman's body was found on Hanbury Street. This time, the situation was far worse. The killer had not only murdered, but had removed some of the victim's internal organs with surgical precision. Annie Chapman, 47 years old, a woman who had once been married to a coachman and lived a respectable life before drink and poverty brought her to the streets. She had been found in the backyard of a lodging house, her body arranged in a grotesque display that seemed almost ritualistic in nature. The killer had taken organs, specific organs, and he had taken them cleanly, without the random butchery you might expect from a madman. This suggested not just anatomical knowledge, but practical experience. We began to realize we were dealing with someone who might have legitimate access to human cadavers, someone who knew the human body, not just in theory, but in practice. We now knew for certain we were pursuing a serial killer, but more than that, we were pursuing someone with skills that made him far more dangerous than any common criminal. And then the letters began arriving. The first came to the Central News Agency, written in red ink that might have been blood, though our analysis was inconclusive. The handwriting was educated, but deliberately crude, as if the writer was disguising his natural script. "Dear boss," it began, and went on to describe the murders with details that only the killer could know. But it was the signature that would echo through history. "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Whether genuine or not, this letter gave our killer his infamous name. Jack the Ripper had announced himself to the world, transforming from an unknown phantom into a character that would haunt the public imagination. The letter spoke with a casual cruelty that was perhaps more chilling than the murders themselves. "I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled," it read, the poor spelling and grammar contrasting with the medical precision of the crimes. More letters followed, each one increasing the public's fascination and fear. The press seized upon every word, every detail, turning our investigation into a public spectacle. Newspaper sales soared as London consumed every morsel of information about the mysterious killer. The very name Jack the Ripper became a brand, a commodity to be sold to a public hungry for sensation and horror. But the real horror was yet to come. September 30th became known as the double event, a night that would test everything we thought we knew about our quarry. 2 murders in one night, within an hour of each other. Elizabeth Stride in Dutfield's Yard, and Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. I remember that night vividly, not just for the crimes, but for the way it felt, as if the very air of London had turned malevolent. The fog was so thick, you could barely see 10 feet ahead. It rolled in from the Thames like a living thing, swallowing buildings whole and turning familiar streets into alien landscapes. We had increased patrols, stationed officers on every corner, yet somehow this phantom slipped through our net twice in the same evening. It was as if he possessed some supernatural ability to move unseen, to strike without warning, and vanish without trace. Elizabeth Stride, known to her friends as Long Liz, was found in Dutfield's yard just after 1 a.m. She was 45 years old, Swedish by birth, and had lived a hard life that brought her to the streets of Whitechapel. But unlike the previous victims, her body showed only the fatal throat wound. The killer had been interrupted, perhaps by the approach of Louis Dimschutz, who discovered the body when he returned to the yard with his pony and cart. The killer had fled, leaving his work unfinished. But he wasn't done for the night. Less than an hour later, in Mitre Square, Catherine Eddowes became the victim of all the rage and frustration the killer felt at being interrupted. The brutality was unprecedented, even by the standards we had unfortunately become accustomed to. Catherine, 46 years old, had been drinking that evening and had been arrested for drunkenness earlier, only to be released at 1 a.m. She walked straight into the arms of the monster. The Eddowes murder showed us something new and terrifying about our killer. When interrupted during the Stride murder, unable to complete his ritual mutilation, he had simply found another victim and made up for lost time. The level of violence inflicted upon Catherine Eddowes was beyond anything we had seen before. It was as if all the killer's frustrated desires had been unleashed upon this one unfortunate woman. Near the crime scene, we found something that would add another layer of mystery to the case. On a wall, written in chalk, were the words, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The unusual spelling of Jews, as Jews suggested either an attempt at disguise or the work of someone for whom English was not a first language. Commissioner Warren ordered the message erased before dawn, fearing it might incite anti-Semitic riots in a neighborhood already simmering with ethnic tensions. To this day, we don't know if those words were written by the killer or someone else entirely. They could have been the work of our murderer, trying to deflect blame onto the Jewish community. They could have been written by someone else entirely, perhaps someone trying to capitalize on the fear and suspicion that gripped the neighborhood. The decision to erase them before they could be properly photographed and analyzed remains controversial among those who study the case. Our investigation consumed every waking moment. We interviewed hundreds of suspects, followed countless leads, and pursued every theory, no matter how far-fetched. The pressure from the press, the public, and our superiors was immense. Every newspaper had its own theory. Every citizen had a suspect in mind. The case had captured the public imagination in a way that no crime had before. And with that attention came expectations that we simply could not meet. We had suspects, ranging from local butchers to foreign sailors, from deranged doctors to members of the royal family. Each seemed promising initially, but none could be definitively connected to all the crimes. The very nature of the East End worked against us. It was a transient population, with people coming and going daily, workers from the docks, sailors from around the world, immigrants seeking a new life, all mixing together in a constantly shifting human tide that made tracking anyone nearly impossible. The medical evidence was our strongest lead. The killer clearly possessed surgical skills, someone familiar with human anatomy in a practical, hands-on way. This led us to focus on doctors, medical students, and butchers. We investigated every physician who had recently lost his license, every medical student with a history of violence or mental instability, every butcher with unusual behavior or a criminal background. One suspect that particularly intrigued me was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and part-time school teacher. He fit the profile in many ways: educated, with possible access to medical knowledge, and he had committed suicide shortly after the final murder. His body was found in the Thames in December 1888, and the timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. But like all our suspects, the evidence remained circumstantial, built more on speculation than solid proof. We also pursued the theory of a foreign sailor. The timing of the murders coincided with certain ship schedules, and the sudden cessation of killings suggested someone who had left London permanently. The docks were full of men from around the world, many with access to knives, and some with rudimentary knowledge of anatomy, from their work butchering animals for ship provisions. But again, the transient nature of this population made thorough investigation nearly impossible. Then came November 9th, 1888. Mary Jane Kelly, just 25 years old, became the Ripper's final and most brutalized victim. Unlike the others, she was killed indoors, in her small room in Miller's Court off Dorset Street. This gave the killer privacy and time to indulge in his most savage desires, and the result was a scene of horror that haunts me to this day. Mary Jane was different from the other victims in several ways. She was younger, prettier, and had only recently fallen into prostitution. Some who knew her said she had dreams of returning to Ireland, of escaping the nightmare of Whitechapel. She had been seen earlier that evening in the company of a man described as well-dressed and foreign-looking. But like so many witness descriptions in this case, the details were vague and contradictory. The scene I encountered that morning when we broke down the door of room 13 Miller's Court still haunts me. The level of mutilation was beyond anything we had seen before, beyond anything I had imagined possible. It was clear the killer had spent considerable time with his victim, and the privacy of the indoor location had allowed him to fully express his madness. The room itself was small and sparse, lit by a single candle that had burned down to nothing. The killer had worked in darkness, or perhaps by the light of the fire in the small grate. What we found in that room suggested that the previous murders had been mere preliminaries, practice runs for what the killer had always intended to do. Every mutilation from the previous crimes was repeated and amplified, as if the killer was creating some kind of grotesque masterpiece. The methodical nature of the destruction suggested hours of work, a level of dedication to his craft that spoke of complete obsession. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. No more murders, matching the Ripper's signature. No more letters. No more terror stalking the streets of Whitechapel. The monster had either died, been institutionalized, left London, or simply satisfied whatever dark compulsion had driven him. The silence was almost as unsettling as the murders had been, leaving us with questions that remain unanswered to this day. We kept the case open, continued investigating every lead, every tip, every rumor. Letters claiming to be from the Ripper continued to arrive for months, even years, but none showed the intimate knowledge of the crimes that the early letters had contained. Most were obvious hoaxes, the work of attention seekers, or mentally disturbed individuals trying to claim infamy they had not earned. The theories about why the murders stopped are as numerous as the theories about who the killer was. Some believe he died, perhaps by suicide like Montague Druitt, unable to live with what he had done. Others think he was committed to an asylum, his madness finally becoming too obvious to hide. Still others believe he simply left London, perhaps returning to whatever country he had come from, carrying his terrible secret with him. But there's another possibility that I've considered over the years, one that chills me more than any of the others. What if the murders stopped because the killer had achieved what he set out to do? What if the 5 canonical victims were not random selections, but specific targets? What if there was a purpose to the killings that went beyond simple bloodlust? This theory has no evidence to support it, but in the dark hours of the night, when sleep eludes me, and I find myself thinking about those autumn days of 1888. I sometimes wonder if we missed something crucial, some connection between the victims that would explain everything. The case also highlighted the social problems of Victorian London in ways that no political speech or social reform movement had managed to do. The plight of these women, driven to the streets by poverty and desperation, became a catalyst for social reform. In death, they achieved a voice that had been denied to them in life. Their murders forced London society to confront the reality of life in places like Whitechapel, to acknowledge that the prosperity and progress of the Victorian era had left many behind. The press coverage of the murders was unprecedented in its scope and intensity. For the first time, a criminal case was followed, not just locally but internationally, with newspapers around the world reporting on every development. The case marked the beginning of the modern relationship between crime, media, and public fascination. Jack the Ripper became the first celebrity killer, his crimes transformed into entertainment for a public hungry for sensation. This media attention had both positive and negative effects on our investigation. On one hand, it brought tips and information from across London and beyond. On the other hand, it created a circus atmosphere that made methodical police work nearly impossible. Every decision we made was scrutinized, every theory debated in the press before we had a chance to properly investigate it. The letters attributed to the Ripper raise questions that persist to this day. Were any of them genuine? The Dear Boss letter and the From Hell letter, which came with half a human kidney, are the most likely candidates for authenticity. But even these are disputed by experts. The handwriting analysis of the time was primitive compared to modern forensic techniques, and the writers could have been hoaxers with inside knowledge rather than the killer himself. What we do know is that these murders changed criminal investigation forever. They marked the beginning of modern forensic science, the first systematic use of photography at crime scenes, and the earliest attempts at what we would now call criminal profiling. The case files from 1888 contain some of the first examples of police trying to understand the psychology of a serial killer, attempting to predict his next move based on his previous actions. The investigation also revealed the limitations of Victorian-era police work. We had no fingerprinting, no blood typing, no forensic pathology beyond basic autopsy techniques. We relied on witness testimony that was often unreliable, especially in a neighborhood where people were naturally suspicious of authority and protective of their own survival. Many potential witnesses were reluctant to come forward, fearing involvement with the police would bring unwanted attention to their own questionable activities. The 5 canonical victims were not the only women murdered in Whitechapel during this period. Martha Tabram was killed in August 1888, just weeks before Ann Nichols, with multiple stab wounds that some believe show the Ripper's early work. Emma Elizabeth Smith was attacked in April 1888 and died from her injuries the next day. Alice Mackenzie was murdered in July 1889, and Frances Coles in February 1891. Whether any of these were Ripper victims remains debated, but they serve to remind us that violence against women in the East End did not begin or end with Jack the Ripper. Over the years, more than 100 suspects have been proposed, from the barely plausible to the completely ridiculous. Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence and grandson of Queen Victoria, was accused based on nothing more than rumor and sensationalism. Walter Sickert, the artist, became a suspect, largely because of his interest in painting murder scenes. Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor, was arrested during the investigation but released without charge, though he fled to the United States and remained a suspect for years. Modern investigators using contemporary techniques have attempted to solve the case, but even with advanced forensic methods, the passage of time has destroyed most physical evidence. DNA analysis has been attempted on letters and other artifacts, but contamination and degradation make definitive results impossible. The case remains as mysterious today as it was in 1888, a puzzle with too many missing pieces to ever be completely solved. Jack the Ripper represents the perfect unsolved mystery, a case with just enough evidence to tantalize, but not enough to convict. Over 130 years later, we're no closer to identifying him than we were in 1888. Perhaps that's fitting. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some shadows are meant to stay dark. Jack the Ripper has become more than a killer. He's become a legend, a symbol of humanity's capacity for evil and our inability to always triumph over it. But let us not forget the real victims in this story. Ann Nichols, who dreamed of getting enough money for a proper lodging. Annie Chapman, who once lived respectably as a soldier's wife. Elizabeth Stride, who came to England seeking a better life. Catherine Eddowes, who had children who mourned her passing. Mary Jane Kelly, who was young enough to believe she might escape Whitechapel's trap. These were real women with real hopes and dreams, not just names in a police file or characters in a sensational story. Their stories deserve to be remembered, their lives honored, and their tragic ends serve as a reminder of how far society has come in protecting its most vulnerable members. They were failed by the system that should have protected them, forgotten by the society that should have valued them, and in death, they became symbols of everything that was wrong with Victorian London's treatment of the poor and desperate. The Whitechapel murders occurred at a time of great change in London and throughout the world. The Industrial Revolution was transforming how people lived and worked, creating new wealth for some and new forms of poverty for others. Immigration was changing the face of neighborhoods like Whitechapel, creating tensions and opportunities in equal measure. Women were beginning to demand greater rights and recognition, though that movement would take decades to achieve significant success. In this context, the murders can be seen as more than just the work of one deranged individual. They were a symptom of larger social problems, a manifestation of the violence and desperation that lurked beneath the surface of Victorian respectability. The killer may have been unique in his methods and his madness, but the conditions that made his crimes possible were widespread and systemic. Thank you for joining me in the shadows of Whitechapel, for walking these dark streets of memory and trying to understand not just what happened, but why it continues to fascinate us more than a century later. If you enjoyed this journey into history's darkest corners, subscribe for more mysteries from the past. Next time, we'll explore another unsolved case that has puzzled investigators for generations, another shadow from history that refuses to be illuminated by the passage of time. Until then, stay curious, and remember that some shadows from the past never truly fade away. They linger in the corners of our collective memory, reminding us that evil exists in the world and that sometimes, despite our best efforts, it escapes justice. But we must continue to seek the truth, to honor the victims, and to learn from the past so that we might better protect the future. The fog has lifted from Whitechapel's streets, but the mystery remains, as impenetrable now as it was on those autumn nights in 1888, when terror stalked the gas-lit alleys of London's East End.